Okay. Yo. So, I actually wanted to explain the crazy stuff that basically happens with me and yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I just got a message and I like die every time someone sends me a message on Tumblr. Like, not even kidding. I like, if I could do backflips, I really would. But I'm gonna read that in a bit. So yeah. Before I explain what's going on with the Effexor, the Seroquel, and the Seroquel extended release, first let me give like a really, really brief tutorial on what exactly the Effexor does. For those of you who don't really understand how neurotransmitter works, I'm a psych major, and I like friggin' love this stuff. Like, this is what I do in my spare time. Like, looking at neurotransmitters could be porn for me if I was that geeky. Sometimes, but not really. Just kidding, kind of. Anyways, so basically, you have the neuron. The neuron. You know, the actual body, little brain, little dendrites, which basically is where all the stuff actually happens, and the little tail, which is called the axon, and yeah. So all this stuff, you don't really need to know the parts, but this is your neuron, right? So when you hear about antidepressants, most of the time on TV you hear about SSRIs. Okay, SSRI. That stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Basically, what happens is you have Mr. Neuron here, or Mrs. Neuron, the neuron, and my bad. And basically, what happens? I fail so bad. Okay, so what happens is I'm a much better teacher when it's not on the internet. Yeah, so what happens is this, is that you have this neuron is the receiving neuron, and this is the sending neuron, okay? So they don't actually connect, because that just work that way. So what happens is that this one sends neurotransmitters through this giant gap called the synapse, and then they connect with the dendrites, which are the little stick awkward thingies, of the receiving neuron, which is basically how you send it from one neuron to the next, okay? Ta-da! Which is basically, all of this is what's going on. The neurotransmitters. I just didn't like writing that all. My handwriting sucks right now. So yeah, all the little dots, for example, are your neurotransmitters, which is basically whenever you see those commercials, it's serotonin. That's like the #1 neurotransmitter that everyone knows about. Most people don't know what it does, but they just assume that's what makes you feel better. Not all the time. But yeah, so what happens is this. What a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor does is this. When this neuron sends out, it sends out all of your neurotransmitters, okay? A certain portion, not all of them actually get absorbed. A certain portion will lock onto each of these ports at the receiving neuron. Now, again, like, if you're using psych terms, it's like the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. We're not going to do all that. So what happens is this, is that the one that's receiving it, the postsynaptic neuron, the one that's receiving it, for example, this one, you see where my knuckles in all these lines, for example, are like 3 different ports. So each of these ports has like a unique key lock to it for certain neurotransmitters, and each neurotransmitter is like a certain key that goes into a certain lock. So when that neurotransmitter is actually into that lock, it's completely, you can't use it. You can't like line them up. It's basically out of use. You know what I'm saying? So you have a limited number of ports over here. So whatever's left gets reabsorbed into the neuron that sends it. So, excuse me, the sending neuron actually reabsorbs whatever's not being taken by the receiving neuron. So what ends up happening is that if you're not producing a lot of serotonin to begin with, then your neurons just take it back, and it's not going forward. So it doesn't actually get forward as much. What happens with reuptake inhibitor, because the process of taking it back is called reuptake, kind of self-explanatory. What happens is a reuptake inhibitor makes sure that these don't go back this way. They don't go back to the sending neuron. They just wait in that synapse so that the moment that the receiving neuron is ready, it just sends it right back. So it just keeps going. So it keeps more like a steady flow. So the whole point of a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor is to keep serotonin in those synaptic gaps so that you continually have that good neurotransmitter going so that you can regulate your moods. Now, Effexor, for example, the one that I'm on, is not an SSRI. It's not solely an SSRI. And this is where people who are on antidepressants kind of don't know and don't really do the really extensive research, because they're not all psych majors. So, they don't really know what's going on. With Effexor at a low dose, i.e. under 300 milligrams, it's a reuptake inhibitor for serotonin. So it's basically whatever is going on, the Effexor, as that medication goes in and blocks all of serotonin so that you keep the serotonin going. But at a certain point, it actually stops doing that for serotonin and it starts working on norepinephrine, which is similar to serotonin, but it does other things that are also related to mood. So it's kind of like if serotonin's not working hard enough, then you go to the next step, which is norepinephrine. So instead, the amount that I was on, which was 300 milligrams, the Effexor is no longer a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it's a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, which is a completely different neurotransmitter. So at that point, each of the neurotransmitters actually cause different things with your body. So when you're taking the medications, you're throwing all of how your body would have naturally dispersed them out of whack. So when you actually take the medication for a long time, your body actually tries to not produce as much because in the way it's feeling, it's not getting it back. So it's thinking it's wasting it. So which is part of the reason why you keep taking more of the antidepressant to make sure what's little bit is still being produced is still being held. So, and then it just switches, neurotransmitters. But, this is part of the reason why when I was on Effexor, it causes such a weird reaction because when you change the doses, I'm changing the neurotransmitter. And each neurotransmitter, when you're in a deficit of it, has a different reaction on the body. And for my body in particular, I just happen to have the full body twitches and convulsions and twerks and not twerks, I can't, twerking, but, jerks and stuff. And even though I've been off of it for like a month and a half now, I still actually have those twitches. And, my doctor's like, you can have those for a few weeks, several months, a couple of years. He's like, we don't really know. And I'm like, and you put me on this, why? So that's just a small tutorial for antidepressants. If you're on antidepressant, I hope this helps a little bit so you can kind of understand it. Do your research, because trust and believe, those things really, really mess with your body. In another episode, I'll tell you about serotonin syndrome. That's absolutely horrible. That is horrible. That's the last thing you'd ever want to happen. That's like being too happy chemically, and that actually will kill you. So it's not really good. But yeah, this is tutorials with Dexter, and I hope that actually helps. I have like acting such a fool right now. So yeah, this is Effexor, and my issues with Effexor, and a small tutorial. And I'll probably explain the Seroquel situation, because people have been, who actually listen to what I post, which I was like, oh my gosh, people actually pay attention sometimes. I feel like a cool kid. To explain what it is and why the Seroquel works the way it does, and why I don't just switch over to risperidol, and what's the issue with atypical antipsychotics and bipolar disorder and their problems and the body. So, again, I'm not actually a doctor, and I'm not trying to be a doctor, maybe a PhD later on in the way, but, it's just little psych facts. So, yeah, I'll see you guys in a bit. Bye!